The Jets are turning their attention to the offseason by cutting running back Dalvin Cook. We'll talk about that and other big Jets offseason questions today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, January 3rd, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out and helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Today we will have our weekly mailbag show. Each Wednesday we try and do a mailbag with listener questions. But before we get into mailbag questions, there was what I would call a minor move by the Jets yesterday, and it's kind of amazing when you think about the player's stature and you think about how big of a deal it was when the Jets signed him. But the Jets did waive running back Dalvin Cook with one game left in the season. Cook had really fallen out of the running back rotation, and reports indicate that he asked for his release. And the reason he did that is quite simple. In the NFL, even when you have an expiring contract, it technically runs until March of the next year. So your contract runs until the new league year begins. So Dalvin Cook, if the Jets did not cut him, would remain technically on the Jets roster until March. Because the Jets cut him, he can now sign with a playoff team. Now, which playoff team would want to sign Dalvin Cook? I'm not sure that there is one, or I'm not sure it'd be well advised for any teams. You know, when you think of playoff teams, you'd have to think smart teams, and I don't think signing Dalvin Cook at this point of his career would be a very smart move. It was a move. The Jets rolled the dice on him. The reasons that they did it is they restructured Aaron Rodgers' contract late, and I think sometimes when a move doesn't work out, we look at the effects and we don't look at the causes. And the causes of this signing are pretty easy to follow. The Jets took forever to complete the Aaron Rodgers trade. It was over a month between Rodgers announcing he wanted to come to the Jets and them completing the trade. Then it took even longer. The Jets dragged their feet on renegotiating the Rodgers deal. Rodgers renegotiates his deal and gives the Jets a bunch of cap space. But by the time the deal was done, by the time the Jets knew how much cap space they had to deal with, there weren't many players available. And Cook was really the only player of any significance. So the Jets rolled the dice on him. I have to take the loss on this one. I thought it was going to work out. I remember it's funny because I've been on the road traveling for the holidays. I think that was like the last time I was on the road. I remember I was in Greece back in August, and I woke up and found that the Jets had signed Dalvin Cook while I was sleeping. And I thought maybe he and Breece Hall could be a great 1-2 punch. His last season in Minnesota was pretty good. But as we saw here, not much left in the tank. No plays longer than 15 yards from scrimmage this year. It didn't work out. Part of the reason it did not work out is you should not sign old running backs. And I say that all the time, and I neglected what I said when I praised this signing. It was a bad signing. It was not a move the Jets should have made. They made it because, again, they dragged their feet on the Rodgers trade. They dragged their feet on the renegotiation. Well, when you do that and you only have Dalvin Cook available as your option, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. So Dalvin Cook now heading somewhere else after a very undistinguished career with the New York Jets. Now let's move into our weekly mailbag. It's the last week of the season, but unsurprisingly, with the Jets at 6-10 out of the playoff race and a game that has zero significance outside of draft positioning and maybe some pride, maybe the Jets couldn't spoil Bill Belichick's last game, a guy who's tormented them through the years. It's not like the other team, New England, has anything to play for. It's not like the Patriots are playing for a playoff spot. So this is just a game to get rid of. And unsurprisingly, most of our questions focus on the offseason. Our first question, like it or not, Woody Johnson is the owner of the New York Jets. Aaron Rodgers means all chips will be in 2024, like it or not. This is if this is the reality versus hope, logic, or wish. Don't we have to be aggressive, making trades to add talent to the end? Outside of John Franklin Myers, what types of contract restructuring could the Jets do to create some cap space? Also, would you think it would be a good idea to make more Ram-style trades for players, trading draft picks for established players. So essentially what the question boils down to is, should the Jets continue this all-in approach this offseason, and how can they do that? And I think we're going to get into this in more detail in the weeks ahead. I think that the Jets would be very ill-advised to continue torching future draft picks, torching future cap space to try and win the Super Bowl in 2024. This team's just not close enough to make it happen in one offseason, or at least to make it a realistic possibility. I think as currently constructed, if Aaron Rodgers is back and healthy and something resembling his former self, the Jets will be a competitive team in 2024. The Jets might even be a playoff team if they get the right breaks. I don't know that adding any other pieces, though, especially older pieces, is going to move the needle all that much. I think the question is whether you want to be a competitive potential playoff team with future flexibility, or you want to be a competitive potential playoff team with an old roster that needs to be turned over and few assets to do so going forward. I mean, the only really question, I don't think the Jets are really monumentally increasing their Super Bowl odds by adding any of these other guys. They're rumored like a David Bakhtiari or Devontae Adams or any other old friends of Aaron Rodgers. I just think they're limiting their future flexibility. And I think as currently constituted, the Jets can end the playoff drought. And I think the focus should be on ending the playoff drought next year rather than winning the Super Bowl. I think that's a more realistic possibility. And again, the Jets have a good core of young talent. I think it could be like one of those situations, kind of like an iceberg, like above the water, you can see that the team's going to be competitive. And below the water, Jets have a chance to reset their cap situation and do it in a way that their fan base will like, because they'll still be competitive, and you're not burning through future resources. But as the question mentioned, Woody Johnson's the owner of this team. So I don't know how realistic it is. And I think that based on some of Woody Johnson's comments over the last couple of weeks, the Jets believe that they're closer to the Super Bowl than I do. So how do they reset their cap situation? There aren't really many obvious cuts for this team that would save a lot of money. If you look at the cuts that would actually put a dent in the salary cap, you have CJ Mosley. That'd save you a little over $10 million. The thing is, if you're going all in, CJ Mosley's probably a player you want on the team. Laken Tomlinson, I don't know that Joe Douglas is going to do that. And here's the thing with cutting Laken Tomlinson. I probably would do it, but you're opening up a pretty big hole at left guard that's not going to be easy to fill. So I don't know that they're going to do that. Of the players I look at, the only one who seems like an obvious cut right now is CJ Uzomah. And that's the state of the Jets cap right now, is that they're close to the cap. Functionally speaking, they don't have a lot of space. Over the cap has them at about $15 million of projected cap space next season. And there's not a lot there aren't a lot of players they can cut, obviously. And part of it's, again, they've pushed a lot of money to 2024 to try and load up in 2023. So are we going to do it again? Well, if you're going to do it again, here's how you do it. You restructure contracts. And here's essentially a very brief breakdown of how that works. Let's say my salary for the season's $5 million. Well, I can your base salary counts against the salary cap. So my base salary of $5 million, that's a $5 million cap hit. But I can convert that to signing bonus. Signing bonus, the player gets a lump sum up front. So essentially, instead of getting $5 million over the course of 17 game checks, $5 million, if your base salary is $5 million, you get it over the course of the 17-week season. Signing bonus means you get the $5 million up front, or they can schedule it however they want. They could do 2.5 now, 2.5 in a few months. That's part of the negotiation for a signing bonus. But the point is, you get more money up front, but it's charged to the cap over the life of your contract. So let's say I convert $5 million of base salary into signing bonus, and I have 5 years left on my contract. Well, then it becomes $1 million for each year, because the signing bonus is divided equally when we're talking about the cap hits over the life of the contract, up to 5 years. So it'd be $1 million, $1 million, $1 million, $1 million, $1 million, because there's 5 years left on the contract. We're dividing $5 million equally over those 5 years. So in essence, you've created $4 million worth of cap space. And we could also do what's known as void years, which is essentially the same thing. You convert money to signing bonus, and you add a couple of years at the end of the contract, but they're not really years because the contract technically voids at a date before the end of the contract. That's really complex. We'll probably have a Cap 101 show before we get into free agency, but that's how you do it. They're going to have to restructure contracts, and they can do it with anybody. It's difficult to say who the targets will be, because last year I wouldn't have projected some of the guys that they ended up restructuring, but I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. And any player's going to want to do it because you get more money up front. See, that's the misconception. I think a lot of people think, oh, you're being a team player by restructuring your contract. Now, if you're taking just a straight pay cut, if you're reducing my $5 million salary to $3 million, that's another way to do it. But more often, it's just converting base salary to signing bonus. And that's probably what we'll see going forward with the New York Jets. Will Mekhi Becton be going forward with the New York Jets. As we continue on this Wednesday mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to the beleaguered left tackle of this team. It's been a tough 4 years for Mekhi Becton. Will there be a year 5 in New York? I don't think so, and I'll tell you why, continuing this Wednesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. You should not have to worry when you're buying tickets to the next big event. Gametime is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their best price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. Let me tell you a story. I've been mentioning on the show how I was in San Diego over the holidays visiting my brother and his family. Well, a bunch of us were going to the Holiday Bowl. It's a college bowl game each year held in San Diego. It was USC versus Louisville. Well, right before we're all ready to head out to the stadium, my 5-year-old nephew says, I want to go. And we didn't think he'd want to go, so nobody bought him a ticket. Nobody knew what to do. I pulled out my phone. I pulled out the Gametime app. The true story. Got a great ticket for a very cheap price. Nephew got to go and was very happy. That could be you. Whether you want to go to a sporting event, comedy, theater, music, you name it, Gametime has it. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Now let's continue with our weekly mailbag. Our next question. Hi, John. Being from the UK, I'm not fully up on the nuances of good offensive line play. So my question is this. Is Mekhi Becton an NFL starting caliber tackle? If so, is he worth bringing back and at what price? Amazingly, he stayed relatively fit this year, but my uneducated eye, he's looked bad most of the season. And this is from Peter from the UK. Peter, I think Becton's really struggled this year. And, he got off to a bit of a rough start the first couple of weeks. And then I thought maybe he was rounding into form a little bit around like week 3, week 4, week 5. And that coincided with the move to left tackle. Whether that had something to do with it, I don't know. We know Becton's been very vocal about wanting to play the left tackle position for the Jets. But, I think he struggled. I'll tell you the area I'm most disappointed with Becton, and there aren't a lot of stats that back this up. So this is really kind of eye test and perception and, kind of going on, checking my views versus people I trust. I've been really disappointed in his run blocking. I mean, if you remember when the Jets drafted him out of Louisville, now part of it was he was just so big, but if you watch some of his highlights at Louisville, I mean, he just moved people. He was just he was a road grader in the run game. And of course, it's different playing in the ACC versus playing in the NFL. But I don't think Becton's been that good of a run blocker this year. That left side of the line, Laken Tomlinson and Mekhi Becton, the Jets should be able to run behind that left side. And they haven't been able to run anywhere. If you look at Breece Hall's numbers, they haven't been great. Last week aside, running the ball. But you see Breece, when he gets the ball in space in the passing game, still plenty explosive. So to me, what that says is the run blocking's not been good enough. And, pass blocking, you knew Becton coming out was more, it felt like he was more advanced as a run blocker than a pass blocker. You knew that there would be some issues in pass protection, especially against speedy guys, because he's so big, he's so long, he's going to struggle to get out of his stance quickly. You hope that he had enough athleticism and combine it with his size, they'd be able to hold up against most edge rushers. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the numbers over the last couple of days, over the last week. I mean, he's at the top of the league in penalties, at the top of the league in sacks allowed. And I guess it's easy to say that, 2 years off an injury, there's some rust. Yeah, the problem, though, is when's Becton going to play well? This is year 4. Year 1 as a rookie, I thought he held up pretty well, at least by the on the curve I was grading him. I thought he was very raw coming out of Louisville. He held up okay. I thought he had some excellent games. He had some poor games near the end of the season, but grading on the rookie curve, I thought year 1 went well. But then year 2, he doesn't play. He plays like 3/4 of the first game. Year 3, he doesn't play. Year 4, it's this much of a struggle. When's Mekhi Becton going to play well? I mean, what has Mekhi Becton done to show us that he belongs in this league? You might be able to talk me, and I go back and forth on this. I mean, I think I said the opposite last week. I'm going back and forth on this. If he comes back as a backup, a cheap backup, maybe you can talk me into it. Maybe then you can sell me on the idea that it's rust. If he gets more playing time, he'll be better. But first of all, despite the fact he's remained relatively healthy this year, can we trust him to stay on the field? I don't think the answer is yes. And can we trust that he's going to play well? No. So that, to me, that takes him out of the starting discussion. And I was very vocal in the offseason. I thought it was crazy for the Jets to go into the season with Dwayne Brown and Mekhi Becton as their two tackles with no plan B. And unfortunately, I think it's played out that way. I think it's played out in a way that has not been good for the Jets. Next question. I'm concerned about the future at quarterback for the Jets. With Aaron Rodgers back in 2024, things are settled there. It could be very well that JD and Robert Saleh are worried about keeping their jobs, but we may be cellar dwellers for a long time without a quarterback of the future. Is there a way we can land one through the draft, through a trade, or through one of the quarterbacks in the upcoming draft? Can we get creative? So the question boils down to, can the Jets find their quarterback of the future this offseason? And I'm going to vary from what a lot of people have to say. A lot of people are saying we got to load up for Aaron Rodgers' last season. Look, I think in the NFL, if you don't have a long-term quarterback of the future, that's got to be your number one priority, finding him. And I understand, I'm sympathetic to some arguments. I'm sympathetic to the argument Jets need to build their team up around the quarterback so they don't throw them into a bad situation. That's been a chronic issue with the Jets when they've drafted these quarterbacks. But the thing is, you don't always get to choose the quarterback at the point that's most convenient for you. And I think when you artificially go into a draft saying we're not drafting a quarterback no matter what, and you need a long-term quarterback, that can prove to be a mistake because there's not a great quarterback available to you every year. The last time the Jets went into a draft and they said, we're not taking a quarterback, this isn't our year, even though we need one long-term, this isn't the year we want to draft one, it was 2017. And you know who they passed on that year? Mr. Mahomes, who went to Kansas City. Now, there's a debate, would Mahomes have been as great without Andy Reid? There's a debate, would he have been as good going to an awful Jets roster? We don't know these things. But that shows you the danger of this idea, well, we have to wait for the year that's right for us. I understand that, the Jets are without a second-round pick this year. Their first-round pick might be the only player they draft who they can reasonably expect to step into the starting lineup, and they have glaring needs at tackle and receiver. But the draft is about the long term, and sometimes you have to think ahead. Now, we don't know where the Jets are going to draft yet, and there's still some part of the process that needs to play out. I mean, we're not, we haven't reached the Senior Bowl, we haven't reached, any of the interviews, we haven't reached the combine, pro day workouts. The college season's not even over. 2 quarterback prospects are playing in the national championship game next week. So there's still a long way to go here, but we don't know who's going to be available for the gig yet. We don't know where the Jets are going to be picking, but I think you have to be open to the idea of taking a quarterback. I'm not saying you go into the draft definitely saying we're taking a quarterback. That's just as big of a mistake. That's the mistake the Jets made in 2021. But if if you think there's a good guy who's available, maybe it's Michael Penix, it could be somebody else. If he's there when you're drafting, I think you've got to consider taking it, because look at the team. We talk about Aaron Rodgers a lot. Well, look at the team that the Jets got Aaron Rodgers from. They got a lot of criticism in the moment for drafting Aaron Rodgers' replacement. They're playing a meaningful game this weekend in what should have been a rebuilding year with Jordan Love, and very well may have found their quarterback of the future. Yeah, it's a short-term hit. You're not going to get an impact from your first-round pick. That hurts your team. But finding your solution at quarterback helps way more than that short-term hit. And I'll go back even further. Mr. Rodgers, he was drafted at a point where it was a similar situation in Green Bay. Brett Favre, they were loading up for his final couple seasons. They took Aaron Rodgers, who did not help them immediately. You think the Packers regret that pick? I think you've got to be open to drafting a quarterback this year in the first round. And that's controversial. And we'll talk about that plenty in the offseason. And this offseason, well, who knows? Maybe it'll have some trades as we continue on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll get into that. We'll talk about some players the Jets could potentially trade, maybe for some extra picks, maybe for some players. How much value do they have? I'll give you some thoughts continuing this Wednesday mailbag edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there's still time to get in on the action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Again, that's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. So that certainly helps you if you're a Jets fan. I don't need to tell you how rough this year's been if you bet the Jets against the spread. And this weekend in New England, the Jets are currently 2.5-point underdogs to the New England Patriots, one of the worst teams in the NFL, yet the Jets are still underdogs. So maybe that's where you want to place your $5 money line bet. And you should know there's no better time to join FanDuel. The app is easy to use, and there are so many different ways to bet, like live same-game parlays. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub. It's the best way to find popular parlays and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. Again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Wednesday, we're doing our weekly mailbag show. We continue our next question. John, I think in a perfect scenario, the Jets maintain their spot in the first round, take an offensive tackle, and accumulate draft capital by trading a player or two. The two players that come to mind are Zach Wilson and John Franklin Myers. What do you think their value is? Do you think they'll be traded? Is there anyone else you could realistically see being traded before the draft? Okay, so a couple things here. I don't think Zach Wilson has a ton of trade value. I'll be honest with you. Like, if it was just about football, I've said this for over a year. Like, I'd keep Zach Wilson around. I'd try and use him as my developmental quarterback, see if he can improve him. I do think that there's been some degree of improvement this year, and just keep rolling with him. The thing is, like, for Zach Wilson's sake, I would probably just try and get him out of here, get him a fresh start, because this has become such a toxic environment, and the Jets have to own their role in that, because they did not need to bring Zach Wilson as the number one backup this year. You knew when Aaron Rodgers went down what probably would happen. He'd have to go out there and struggle on a team that wasn't that good. So the Jets have to own some of that. But I think for Zach Wilson's sake, you try and get him out of here. Let him start somewhere new and try and rebuild his career. I'm guessing you're looking at a late day 3 pick for Zach Wilson. I mean, I know the Jets were able to get a 2, a 4, and a 6 for Sam Darnold, but that was a different case. I think in the case of Darnold, there was a view the Jets really damaged him. There was a view that Adam Gase was Adam Gase, so maybe if we get him away from Adam Gase, he would succeed. But I just don't think there's going to be a big market for Zach Wilson. I don't think there's any team that's going to be willing to give Zach Wilson a starting job. And that's the only way to get a big return for Zach Wilson. So I don't think there's going to be a big market for him. John Franklin Myers is actually a guy I would look to trade, because I feel like he's got good value. He's near the end of his prime, but he's not quite there yet. He can play on defensive tackle. He can play defensive end. He's got a reasonable contract. So, like, for me, this is like the old trade a guy a year too soon principle. There was a legendary baseball GM, Branch Rickey. He was actually the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who signed Jackie Robinson. And he was just really one of the great executives in North American sports, like any sport. Absolute genius, a guy who was decades ahead of his time, a guy who used advanced statistical analysis, 50, 60 years before anybody else was. And he had an old saying that's better to trade a player a year too soon than a year too late. And the idea is that if you trade a player a year too soon, yeah, you miss out on a good season for him, but you get something in return for him. You trade a player a year too late, his value is gone. I feel like that's the John Franklin Myers principle right now, because I feel like he's probably near the end of his prime. He's probably got a good year or two left in him, but you've already seen kind of some decline from his play this year. And the other aspect of this is, if you trade him, it kind of opens up a slot to keep Bryce Huff, who's younger, who's entering his prime. So you get rid of the guy in his late prime, you keep the guy who's entering his prime, and it creates cap space for you. It probably pays, probably goes a long way towards paying to keep Bryce Huff, and you get Bryce Huff for more years. What could JFM bring in? If I'm optimistic, maybe a late day 2 pick. Maybe I'm overly optimistic on a 1-year rental. Maybe it's more of an early day 3 pick. That's a guy I would look to deal. Other players who could have trade value, maybe DJ Reed, plays a premium position, has a great contract. He's a little undersized. He depends on a lot on his athleticism. Entering his late 20s, is he going to age well? I mean, I think the last couple of weeks, DJ Reed hasn't played all that well, and I'm wondering, is that just is it just a bad couple weeks, or is it the start maybe us seeing decline again, maybe a year too early? And you also have still have Sauce Gardner, you still have Michael Carter II. The corner position is still the area of strength. Could you get a day 2 pick for DJ Reed? I think potentially. Other guys who come to mind, I don't think they'll trade CJ Mosley. I think you could probably get a late pick for CJ Mosley, some team looking for leadership, a quality linebacker. I don't think they'll do it. Tyler Conklin, I joke around a lot about Conklin. He's been perfectly fine this year. But if you look at his stats are probably inflated. And the reason his stats are probably inflated is, like, the Jets don't have any receivers to throw to. So a lot more targets are funneling to Conklin than they should be otherwise. And I look at this and I say, Jeremy Rucker could probably replace Conklin, or come close to replacing Conklin. If some team may do some box score scouting on Tyler Conklin and think he's more valuable than he really is. So I look at it and I think maybe you could get, like, I don't know, maybe a 4th round pick or something like that. So these are just my guesses. I mean, always difficult to judge player values. It depends. It goes from team to team. One team may value a player a lot more than the other teams will, but those are my guesses on some potential trade targets for the New York Jets. Our last question. Hi, John. You've talked in the past about how process is usually more important than results. We've seen Douglas have decent process and results in the draft, waiver wire, pickups, and trades. But it's a different story when it comes to contract negotiations, whether it's for free agents, re-signing his own, or even draft picks. What do you see that's broken in Douglas's process in contract negotiations, and what needs to be fixed? That's a great question. So I don't know that I think process is more important than results, but I think good process typically leads to good results. You can have bad process and leave you good results. You have good process that leads to bad results, but typically over the long run, good process is leads to good results. Bad process leads to bad results. So I do focus on process. There are a couple issues I have with Douglas in free agency. Now, the thing with Douglas is like he had the easiest act to follow ever because Mike Maccagnan was so bad in free agency that like anybody would look good next to him. Maccagnan like gave blank checks to guys who weren't anywhere near worthy of the money that he gave, like Trumaine Johnson. These are my thoughts on Douglas. One is that I think he's too, and this is also an issue in the draft. If we talk about Douglas's draft process, I think Douglas has been a decent drafter, but I think there are some issues with his process. One is he's just like too obsessed with traits. And in free agency, he clearly bets on pedigree. He signs guys who have been disappointments, who are early round picks, who have great athletic testing numbers, or at least did when they came out. Mecole Hardman's an example of this. Jared Davis, his first year. Corey Davis. He tries to find guys who, again, were draft disappointments, but have elite physical tools, and he thinks he can fix them. And outside of Sheldon Rankins, I don't think he's done a very good job of identifying these people. And yet you want to look more for results. Second issue, you want to look more for results, guys who have played well when you try and sign free agents. The second thing that comes to mind, I like that Douglas has his price and sticks to it. I think you have to have discipline. I think you can really mess your cap up if you don't have discipline when you're making contract negotiations. Now, Douglas has messed the cap up, but it's not for that reason. I do think there's occasionally a player, and this has especially been true on the offensive line, where the player just matters so much that it becomes less than an academic exercise. What do I mean? It's like normally if like a guy's the ninth best, I don't know, linebacker in football, you would not want to make him more than the ninth highest paid linebacker. I think on the offensive line, there's such a dearth of talent in this league that if there's an elite young guy who hits the market, you may want to overpay for him. Jack Conklin back in 2020 when the Jets settled for George Fant's an example. Orlando Brown last year when the Jets let him get away to Cincinnati. I think that Douglas maybe at times is a little too disciplined, if that makes sense. I mean, I like his overall philosophy of not like overpaying, not setting the market. I do think that there are some instances, especially with the young linemen entering their prime, where it makes sense to do that. So those are a couple of areas where I think I would criticize Douglas in free agency a little bit. And again, that first area where he focuses too much on traits, I think that's just an overall weakness. I see that in the draft also. Becton over Tristan Wirfs is a good example of that. Lots of other examples, but those are some areas that come to mind for me with Douglas. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening to let you never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow with Mike Debate, crossover Thursday, Jets Patriots. Can't wait.